Right, good evening, cowboys and aliens. My name's Danny. This is My Own Worst Enemy, mental health podcast. Right, okay, so, I usually like to sort of preface these episodes with a little anecdote from the annals of my otherwise tedious existence. But this week, I'm afraid I'm going to be spending that time sort of asking you guys to do me a favour to sort of help me out with something. So, even though most of my audience gets the podcast via like SoundCloud, iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, whatever it's called, in sort of audio format, I also upload all these episodes to my YouTube channel, and I've been doing since the beginning. And, of course, now that I've sort of expanded into video podcasts as well, YouTube has become sort of more central to what we're doing here. And anyway, so I don't know, you might have heard in the news about the changes to YouTube partner program or whatever it is. But anyway, last Wednesday I woke up to the following email. It says, My Own Worst Enemy, today we are announcing changes to the YouTube partner program. While our goal remains to keep the YouTube partner program open to as many channels as possible, we recognise the need for more safeguards in place to protect creator revenue across the YouTube ecosystem. Under the new eligibility requirements announced today, your YouTube channel, My Own Worst Enemy, is no longer eligible for monetization because it doesn't meet the new threshold of 4,000 hours of watch time within the past 12 months and 1,000 subscribers. As a result, your channel will lose access to all monetization tools and features associated with the YouTube Partner Program on February 20th, 2018, unless you surpass this threshold in the next 30 days. Accordingly, this email serves as 30 days notice that your YouTube Partner Program terms are terminated. So, basically, it used to be that in order to qualify for earning revenue on YouTube, you just needed, I think it was 100 subscribers and 10,000 views on all your videos. But like it's just said now, the new qualification is you need 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 hours of watch time. Now, we already qualify for the watch time. In fact, last year, you guys listened to something like 7,000 hours worth of this podcast on just on YouTube alone, which is insane, and amazing. But it's the subscriber count where we fall short. So you need 1,000, and we're currently on 600. We was on something like 570 the other day, but then I put this request up on the Facebook page and managed to bump it up to the 600 mark, which, again, it's brilliant. 25, 30 people just sort of going out the way to get involved, which I thought was great. So just for the sake of transparency, in case anyone thinks I'm sort of making this appeal because I risk losing some penthouse apartment and a Lamborghini that YouTube pays for, the channel had just recently, in the past few months, gotten to the point where it was earning, on average, about £9 a month. So, there's a month there where it was earning 6, and then there was one month where it earned 11. So, on average, it's about £9 a month. And, I don't know, maybe you think even that's too much, because, I think I've mentioned this before, but I did have someone refuse to be a guest on the podcast because during the first year that this podcast was going, the YouTube channel earned, I think it was something like $14. And, they asked about it and I told them, and then they considered that profiteering. But, whatever. But yeah, anyway, about £9 a month, which, over the course of 12 months is, what is that, 10 months, 90, £108. And so the total cost of running this little venture is about £300 a year. So there's there's the hosting for the website. There's the website itself is like a custom theme where I sort of pay for ongoing support. There's a couple of premium WordPress plugins I use to improve functionality. There's a service I pay for to sort of protect the site from being hacked. There's an automated backup service in case anything goes wrong. There's this SoundCloud, of course, who I pay to sort of host the podcast audio and distribute it to iTunes and Stitcher and what have you. So all in all, I think it was, I reckoned it up last night, I think it was something like £297.44, I think was the exact figure, yearly, that is. And so this £100 a year from YouTube, made a significant dent in those overheads. It's 1/3 of the bill was covered. And I ain't Rockefeller, by any stretch of the imagination. So, so the difference between sort of coughing up £200 a year and £300 a year was, well, significant, So it's just a bit shit, really. But it is what it is, and I do understand why YouTube are doing it. Anyway, so here's my appeal to you. And I don't want to sort of beg people to subscribe just for the sake of it. I know a lot of the smaller channels who got the same announcement, they're sort of subscribing to each other to sort of get the numbers up, and I just think that's a bit, I don't know, it's like sort of a bit spammy and shallow, and I don't want to do it that way. So it's, I'm only speaking to the people here that sort of match up to the following criteria, and three things. So if you're a regular listener, B, you enjoy the show, you want to help support it, and C, you already have a YouTube account, I'd really, really appreciate it if you guys would sort of take, 30 seconds to log into YouTube, search My Own Worst Enemy podcast, and just click the subscribe button. That'd be amazing. It'd mean a lot to me if you did that. And, I've got to say, it's unlikely that we're going to reach the 1,000 subscribers by the 30-day deadline. I mean, put it this way, it's taken us a year and a half to get to 600. So the chances of us gaining an extra 400 people in 30 days is pretty much slim and none. But, no harm in trying and all that, I suppose. And, whatever we manage to get to, I genuinely appreciate the support. So, yeah, anyway, I hate having to do stuff like this, but it's, it is what it is. Anyway, so moving on. Today's episode, we are talking about depersonalization disorder. My guest today is Dr. Elaine Hunter. Elaine is the consultant clinical psychologist and clinical lead of the Depersonalization Disorder Service at the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, and since 1999 has been developing a cognitive behavioural model of DPD, that is, depersonalization disorder. She is the co-author of Overcoming Depersonalization and Feelings of Unreality, a self-help guide using cognitive behavioural techniques, and has written many published papers on the theory and practice of working psychologically with depersonalization disorder. Elaine has a long-standing interest in international development work, including 7 months teaching CBT to public health clinicians in Uganda and Zimbabwe, and helping to set up a psychology service in Sierra Leone for nationals who worked in the Ebola treatment centres during the epidemic. In today's episode, we explore what it feels like to experience depersonalization and derealization, whether depersonalization is a symptom of anxiety or the result of a chemical imbalance, common circumstances which can trigger an episode, the cognitive behavioural perspective on how and why depersonalization becomes chronic, and we share some tips and advice on how to deal with the symptoms. Now, Elaine isn't on social media, but she did recommend a bunch of different resources for people wanting to learn more about depersonalization disorder, and you can find all those listed in the show notes. Just go to myownworstenemy.org. Now, it's been a long time in the making, this episode. I think I first contacted Elaine about a year ago now, and, even though I wanted to sort of cover this topic as quick as possible, also, I didn't want it to be anyone else, because basically, when you Google depersonalization, most of the news articles, the research, what have you, sort of all roads lead back to Elaine. She's the go-to person on this topic. So, I hope you enjoy it. I definitely think it's been worth the wait. More than that, I hope people that actually experience this, I hope you find this episode helpful and reassuring, because, I've got to say, I know from personal experience that the hardest part of this particular issue to deal with is wondering whether or not you can actually recover from it. And, well, let me spoil the ending for you. You can recover from it. I did and continue to do so. And, so do many people that Elaine continues to work with. So, with all that said, on that hopefully reassuring note, without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Elaine Hunter. Right. Okay. Elaine Hunter, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, nice to be invited, Danny. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, right. So this subject, this episode gives me the creeps. I've got to be honest. It's
okay.
We are talking about depersonalization and maybe derealization as well, but even that will pass out a little bit. Yes, it's. So I've got very, very sort of deep personal experience with this particular malady, if we're going to call it that. But as always, before we jump into all that, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, like your research interests, and I'm really intrigued how you came to specialise in this particular subject as well.
Okay, great. Yeah. So as I said, my name, I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. which means that I mainly do assessment and talking therapy, so I don't get involved in medication. And I've worked in depersonalization really for a very long time, actually. So how I got into it was that I did my undergraduate degree, and then I went straight on to do a PhD. And the PhD was in childhood abuse, very severe childhood abuse, and how that affected people's memories. And during the course of that research, I got talking to a lot of people about their dissociative experiences during the abuse as it was happening or after the abuse. And I got more and more interested in that. I found it quite fascinating. And people were often talking to me about experiences of sometimes losing memories for the abuse, but also feeling depersonalized and very detached from their experiences. So when I finished my PhD, I was then looking for work in a research area, and the depersonalization research unit, as it was then, had just been set up. And so I came in as the first psychologist in the clinic. So that was back in 1998. And so at that point, I worked in the research unit for about 2 years full time. I was then doing some CBT training and started to do research in the area, really trying to understand the condition from a psychology perspective. And it was there's been quite a few publications that have come out from that period of time where the CBT model of depersonalization disorder, the epidemiology, looking at how frequent it is in different disorders, quite a few other papers that I was involved with as well. So that's how I kind of got interested in it. But actually, when I came to the research unit and started meeting people with depersonalization disorder, what I discovered was that the people that I was often seeing in the clinic didn't have a trauma history at all. Often really no trauma at all from their childhood. So that surprised me because in my research, obviously, I've been seeing people with a lot of trauma. So they were presenting often a lot more with anxiety difficulties, and often the depersonalization starting after some drug use as well. So it made me recognize that there was sometimes different routes into the depersonalization, derealization. So that's kind of how I got involved in it initially, and then actually I worked for about 2 years full time in the unit, and then actually I went off and did my full clinical psychology training, which is a kind of 3-year doctorate, and then since then I've worked in lots of different areas of psychology: primary care, secondary care, psychosis I worked in for many years, but I've always maintained doing some work with depersonalization, derealization since those early days. And in the last 3 years now, I've come back to the what is now an NHS service that's at the Maudsley Hospital in London, and I've kind of come back as the clinical lead for that service.
Yeah, so,
and so Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so am I right in thinking that this research lab is the only one in the UK? Is that correct?
Okay, so it was originally a research unit, but what's happened in the more recent years is that it's become an NHS service. So so people are able to be referred to the NHS clinic, and we also continue to do some research, but they're now separate parts. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there's now an NHS clinic. People can go to their GP and ask to get referred. There isn't anything to do with research, and then there is still sometimes some research going on in the background, but we're primarily a clinical NHS service now.
Right, it's just because it seems to be one of these mental health issues, which is sort of strangely not a lot of people know about it. Or if you go on the internet, go on Google and stuff, there's plenty of stuff out there from personal experience, and I'm not sure what the if the epidemiology backs that up, whether it's a common experience, but from a research perspective, like books on it and stuff, it seems like a really specialist subject. So just wondering if you could sort of square that for us, whether that's, is it a common experience, and if so, why so little attention on it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a very common transient experience for a lot of people. So the study that I tend to quote is a study that was done in the US, where people were randomly phoned up, and the symptoms of depersonalization, derealization were described to people, and they were asked to say whether they'd experienced that in the last year. And 23% of people reported that they'd experienced it in the last year. So this is not within a clinical population in a hospital, mental health hospital. This is actually just out in the community. So there's lots of people that report having transient symptoms, and those are often where people might be very tired or jet lagged or hungover, or where people have an experience where they have something that's a bit shocking for them. So something like a sort of minor traffic accident. If you think about something that might have happened to you, you might have suddenly kind of felt everything's a bit surreal. You're just kind of going through the motions of things. It feels a bit dreamlike. But those experiences usually only last seconds, minutes, maybe hours or days at the most. So those are very, very common. And then I suppose there's the more serious conditions. So for some people, these what are common transient symptoms then develop into something that's a lot more chronic. Doesn't come and go, it stays. It's also very upsetting and distressing and can get in the way of functioning. So when you look at how prevalent that is within mental health conditions, it's very common. And I suppose it is less common for people to have it as the main symptom. So very common with anxiety, depression, a whole range of psychological and psychiatric conditions, but less common just to have it as the main condition. But I think there's reasons why it's been seen as being rarer than it actually is, because even when we've done research looking at how common it is for the disorder, we actually find it's about 1% to 2%. So we've done a couple of studies. That's also been some studies in America and also some studies in Germany. And it's all around the same percentage, so 1% to 2%. Now that's actually equivalent of something like schizophrenia or something like OCD. And you certainly wouldn't expect there just to be one clinic in the entire country for schizophrenia or one for OCD. So you kind of think, why is it that the depersonalization, derealization is so under-recognized? So I'm not sure of the answer to it, but I think some of it is that there has been this sort of myth within clinicians that it always is just a symptom of other conditions.
Right.
So I think people with who have it as a primary problem are often kind of arguing back, saying, well, actually, this is the main issue. And they're often telling me that people are saying, well, it's really just anxiety. It's really just depression. So I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding within clinicians that it can also be a disorder in its own right. And I think some of it is also that it's an extremely difficult thing to put into words. So I think, as anyone who experiences it will tell you, it's really difficult to describe. So I think there's a kind of, if you've got clinicians that, if they know about it at all, and I think there's still a lot of awareness that's lacking in the psychiatric and mental health professions, sadly, which is what we're trying to do, a lot of awareness raising to try and improve. So there's a lot of not knowing anything about depersonalization, derealization. The people that do know about it think it's more of a symptom of other conditions rather than a disorder in its own right. And the people experiencing it are finding it very difficult to describe. I think that kind of combination of factors means that people aren't just diagnosing it properly.
Right.
And so then it becomes, there's a sort of myth that it's a very rare disorder. But when, as I say, when you look at the figures, it's as common as OCD and schizophrenia. And so gradually over time, we're kind of doing a lot more awareness raising of that. And last year particularly, we did a lot of publicity through British Medical Journal, targeting more GPs, but also we had a BBC, a short documentary that was in a BBC Two program, the Victoria Derbyshire Show, and then we've had radio programs since then, and also some things in the newspapers. And when we do anything like that, there's a huge wave of people saying, that's exactly what I've got. I didn't really know what it was. My GP didn't know what it was. Oh my goodness, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. How do I get help from this? So I think there's just a lot of a lack of awareness, both in the general population and in the medical profession, and even in the mental health professions as well. So we're kind of trying to do awareness raising on all those levels.
Okay, so let's pass some of those things out now. So the first thing I think to do is this idea of the actual symptoms of depersonalization, and we'll sort of tie in this problem of describing them. So we sort of skimmed over them, but if you could elaborate on that. So what is the subject? Because obviously for people that are familiar with it, they'll be like, oh, I know exactly. But people that aren't familiar with it, what is the subjective experience of being depersonalized? Okay,
good. So, I suppose the essential features of depersonalization and derealization, and I'll explain in a minute what the difference is between those two. What makes it different from anything else is that people will be describing a sense of being things feeling very unreal and surreal in either in their environment, the sort of external world, or within themselves. So people will say things like, it looks like the world doesn't really exist. It looks unreal. It looks sort of dreamlike. I feel as though I'm in a dream. I feel detached from the outside world. So sometimes there can feel like a sort of physical barrier between yourself and the outside world that's often described as being sort of almost trapped within a glass bubble, or a veil between you and the world, or some sort of sense of almost a barrier.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of a sense of things feeling dreamlike, detached, and that can also be the person themselves. So sometimes people feel like they almost don't exist anymore. That they don't feel real. They don't recognize themselves when they look in the mirror. They don't recognize parts of their body when they look at it, like they can look at their hands and their arms, and logically they know it's them, but it doesn't feel like them. And that's a really important distinction, this, because it's not so somebody who may be psychotic or hallucinating or delusional in some way would actually believe that is reality. But people with depersonalization, derealization know that this is not real.
Yes.
But it just feels as if, and that as if is quite key. It's very distressing because they know that this is not really how things are, but they feel so cut off and detached from themselves and the world. And it's actually quite a complicated syndrome, because that's the kind of key aspects that I suppose as a clinician you would be listening out for, that makes it makes it very different actually from other disorders. So people with depression or anxiety or other problems aren't going to be really describing that in quite the same way.
Yeah, sorry, Elaine, the reason I'm laughing with, I'm not laughing at. So when you were saying things like, so again, I've got a lot of personal experience with this. And I would say, for me, it's interesting, this use of sort of metaphorical language. It's not emotional language like it would be with anxiety and depression. It's like you say this, where you said the veil. For me, I always used to say it felt like a veil dropped between myself and the outside world, or the world felt foggy. It felt like the brightness had been turned down on the world. Another way it felt to me was, it was as if everything was like the world became a hologram. So it was everything was there and everything looked real, but it didn't feel real, whatever that means. And again, the one with the hands, I don't know if you do yourself any favors if you've got depersonalization, but standing in the mirror looking at yourself or looking at your hands and wondering how this all works and how you're all connected. And like you say, it's like, I know that's my hand, but it doesn't feel like my hand. It feels like its own entity out there, sort of detached from me. Really, really bizarre experience.
Yes. So that kind of sense of detachment, of unreality, I think those are the really defining features that make it very different and distinct from any other problem. But that detachment can also, within the sense of self, people can feel detached from their own kind of what should be normally integrated functions. So things can kind of feel like they're not really connecting together. So the definitions of the two, derealization is where you get this sense of unreality about the external world, so the things that you're looking at, and depersonalization is where that's more applying to yourself. Like you don't feel real, you don't feel like you exist anymore. But for most people, the two things co-occur, and sometimes people will say, really, can you distinguish between the two? But actually, there are some people where it's just the external world, or it's just their sense of themselves. So it is worth having that distinction, but for about 75% of people, they have both things happening at the same time. But in addition to those kind of sensations of unreality, I often go through in my mind a kind of checklist when I'm talking to somebody about other kinds of detachment or numbing that's very common. So people will often talk about feeling emotionally numb, that they can't connect to their emotions at all. So they know how they should be feeling, but they can't feel it. And that goes for positive emotions, but also negative emotions as well. So sometimes people say, well, I know I'm anxious, but I can't actually feel it. Or I'm sad, but again, I feel detached from my negative emotions. So that's a way of distinguishing depersonalization from depression, because a depressed person would not be able to feel the happy emotions, but they would acutely be feeling the negative emotions. But with depersonalization, there's a kind of emptiness, a detachment from any emotions at all. The other thing that people often talk about is a physiological numbing, so not being able to feel their body. So it might be about not being able to feel the weight of their body, or feeling numb in all or parts of their body. Sort of like they can't really. One person described it to me as almost like having a local anesthetic over their whole body.
Wow.
And sometimes people can then feel like they might just disappear, or they're almost invisible. They literally can't feel themselves within their body at all. And it's a little bit different. Sometimes people will also have what are called out-of-body experiences. Those are a little bit different. So those are times typically where you can see, you're watching yourself, usually from sort of up above, watching yourself going through the motions of things. It's a little bit different from the depersonalization. The people with depersonalization They may be experiencing that as well, but they may feel like they're not really in their body, but sometimes it's just they kind of know their body exists, but they can't feel it.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that description as well. This kind of like an out of body experience. It's sort of like almost like you're experiencing the world in the third person.
Yes.
Even though you're not literally looking at yourself through a camera, it's not that literal visual experience, but it just feels that way.
Yeah. So a lot of people, like you say, will also have, particularly with the derealization, the external world looks strange, and also it often looks flat and two-dimensional, or like you were saying, it can be like it almost looks like the world is just projected onto a screen. So you're kind of detached from it. You're not in the world. You're just watching it. And again,
Sorry, Elaine, go on.
But I was going to say that sometimes people, in trying to describe their symptoms, can come up with really evocative descriptions. So I had one man who was talking about how he got better through the depersonalization, derealization. And he was kind of saying that, at the beginning, when it was at its worst, the world was just projected onto a screen. And then gradually, everything still remained 2D, but he got a sense of one thing being in front of another, a bit like a pop-up book, if you remember those from the olden days. And then gradually, as he got better, things started to become a bit more three-dimensional, and he started to feel a bit more in the world rather than just watching the world.
Yeah.
So it's a really, to me, it's a completely and utterly fascinating phenomenon. And as you were saying earlier, about research and stuff, I have no idea really why it's been so under-researched, because I think it is a really interesting but also very distressing, and we really need a lot more people being involved in research and to get better treatments. So there's some of the other. So there's a lot of visual disturbances that people can have as well. So some of that, like I was saying about the perceptual feeling of flatness and being disconnected from the world. But people will often talk about other kind of visual things. So as you were saying about maybe colours being a bit different, maybe not as bright, or sometimes people say they're brighter. Just things looking bigger or smaller than they actually are. Lots of kind of visual disturbances that can happen as well.
Yeah, I think the final one I'll add, which I've seen a lot of people sort of say on the forums and stuff, is if everyone's ever seen, it's one of the Men in Black films, it's basically a human. It looks like a human, but then they open his face up and there's a little alien inside the skull controlling. That's another sort of description of it. It's almost like you're just this pair of eyeballs, or you're a little person in your own head controlling this body. Oh, it's such it is, like you say, it is fascinating. It's such a the use of metaphorical language, and there's seems like very sort of philosophical undertones there as well that you don't sort of find with other issues.
So the other things that people can sometimes experience is, as you say, the kind of the whole meaning of existence can come into question.
Yeah.
But people sometimes describe it as almost like a sort of Matrix moment, where, I don't know if you've seen the film The Matrix, where suddenly the world is completely different from how you've always understood it. And there's a kind of quite terrifying and shocking kind of sense of, oh my goodness, the world is completely different, and what does it actually mean to be in the world, and what is the world, and what is existence, and what does my existence mean? And all of that can then lead into sort of quite existential philosophical questions that no one's been able to kind of ever really answer. So you can imagine if you're feeling really not very well and trying to, grapple with these philosophical questions, how difficult it can be.
Okay, so let's move on to some like the causes now, and this also ties into what you were talking about before about this idea of whether it's a sort of a distinct phenomenon or whether it is sort of just a symptom, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So, what are the most common maybe causes, reasons for onset, or like things with comorbidity? I'll just sort of throw that at you as a messy ball of a question and let you unravel that one.
Yeah. Okay. So as I said before, that people can experience it just as transient symptoms.
Yeah.
And I really strongly believe that every person has the potential to experience depersonalization, derealization, given the right set of circumstances. But for some people, they will never, experience that sort of level of kind of stress or anxiety or feeling overwhelmed, trapped. So those tend to be the things that fundamentally seem to lead somebody into suddenly having this kind of shutdown of these systems. Because what I hear when people are talking about it, it's like they're often talking about different things, and there's certainly in the clinic we see a common trigger being anxiety.
Yeah.
So that can be, quite chronic anxiety that's then reached a sort of crescendo point, or it can also be somebody who hasn't had too much anxiety, but something happens where their anxiety is suddenly so acute that it becomes overwhelming for them. And another common trigger is an adverse drug reaction, but usually that is also accompanied by being very frightened. So with the drugs, I don't think it's the drugs per se that are causing it, but if people have take some drugs and then have a really kind of, the kind of cliche bad trip, and they may have some depersonalization, derealization within their drug reaction, and then get very, very frightened about it. And so people are often talking about having a panic attack during taking drugs. And that combination seems to often trigger the kind of depersonalization and becoming a bit more chronic. So we've got an anxiety route, we've got a drug route, and the other route, as I was talking about earlier, are people that have had lots of traumas in their life, who will then often develop depersonalization, derealization as a result of those things. So at its kind of fundamental, what seems to be happening is that when people get to a point of sort of an inescapable situation where they feel utterly overwhelmed by emotions, particularly kind of fear and anxiety, there seems to be this innate, I believe, quite an innate mechanism of shutting down and cutting off, a sort of detaching from your emotions, your physical sensations, the reality of the world. And that's what seems to be happening with the phenomenon, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the most common theory I've read about anyway is, like you say, it's like a trauma defense mechanism. So it's where any kind of overwhelming, stressful situation, the idea is it sort of shuts down the emotional part of the brain in order to protect you from some sort of emotional overwhelm, almost maybe, I don't know, maybe like something that's going to protect you from PTSD or something like that. Is that right?
Well, I would pick you up on a couple of things there. So the one is about trauma,
right?
Because one of the things with as a clinician, people are often, as opposed to a lay person. So in the kind of general population, when people about things being traumatic, they usually just mean things being really horrible or very stressful or anxiety provoking. In the kind of clinical community, when people talk about trauma, there's a very precise definition of what is trauma. And it usually means that you feel that you're going to die at that period of time, or something, is going to be a really physical or psychological harm coming to you. And so that's often people are kind of like, well, you haven't experienced trauma, so how can you be experiencing these kind of depersonalization, derealization? So rather than talking about it being trauma, I think it's better to think about really overwhelming emotional states. Does that make sense? I know it sounds
Yes.
like I'm being a bit pedantic there, but I often get people kind of being referred, and the clinician will be saying, but they don't seem to have had any trauma. It's really puzzling. And they're saying that they've got this problem, which is only about trauma. So I think, being in a really acute panic attack state, I mean, you could say, well, that is traumatic, but in the kind of clinical profession, you wouldn't talk about that being trauma. You talk about it being a panic attack.
Right.
And the other thing that you were talking about was this kind of emotional shutdown. But as I said, there is the emotional detachment, but there is also physiological detachment as well, where you can't feel your body. So you can imagine that, that's very helpful if you're kind of in the middle of a panic attack, if you can't actually kind of feel the physiological sensations of anxiety. And there is also, we missed it out, I think, when we were talking about the different symptoms. There is also what I call a kind of cognitive numbing. So people with depersonalization often talk about really not being able to process information, not being able to kind of put things together in a logical way in their mind. So it's almost like you think about emotion shutting down, physical sensations shutting down, the mind it's shutting down, and a kind of detach from the whole world. And that's what seems to be happening. So, which is obviously, incredibly terrifying for people that are experiencing it and don't know what's going on.
Well, that's interesting. You say that, Elaine, because there seems to be a bit of a paradox there, because there's this idea of sort of emotional numbing, but at the same time, it's the feeling of being emotionally numb that makes people feel scared and unsettled by the symptoms themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, yeah. So that's why I think for most people, it should only be a very transient thing. So the example that I often give is, say you were in a car accident, or actually maybe something a bit more dramatic, like an earthquake or something, that if you were able to kind of feel, well, it's all kind of surreal, but I feel like it's all dreamlike, and I can just get up and pick my way out of this and get out of here, and it's all weird. You can see that actually that would be a lot more functional and a sort of survival mechanism than actually just feeling completely overwhelmed and not able to do anything.
Right.
So I think in the short term it is a sort of survival mechanism. But what happens is that it can be quite traumatizing in itself, and very frightening when you don't really know what is happening to you.
Yeah.
And that then fear about what has happened, and certainly the common one is that when people have done it in the context of drug taking, that they often think that they've done, they've damaged their brain in some way.
Yeah.
Or, with anxiety states, they're kind of like, oh my goodness, something, there's some neurological condition that I've got. And so that initial anxiety can be perpetuated by fears about what the experience of depersonalization and derealization is. So you have the initial experience, and for some people they're like, oh my goodness, that was terrible, and I'm out of the situation now, and they start to settle, as the distress comes down, the depersonalization, derealization also comes down, and they get over it.
Yes.
But with other people, it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, that they then feel very frightened about the symptoms themselves. And then that fear then is like more petrol going on flames, and it just keeps the problem going.
Yeah, so you know what, Elaine, I can speak to many sort of facets of this. So I remember being in a car accident when I was a teenager, and I remember getting out of the car, and the scene was just completely bizarre. All the traffic had stopped. There was glass all over the road. There's this all this mangled metal, and people stood around. And I remember being a very sort of spaced out experience, but it was what it was, and I kind of got on with it. Again, I remember in my early 20s, I had this harebrained idea that I was going to go be a screenwriter in Hollywood. So I had this stupid idea to just throw this screenplay I'd written in a backpack, and saved up enough for the plane, and it was like, oh, I'll just survive when I get over there and figure it out. And I remember that night I arrived in LA. I got into this scruffy old motel that I could just about afford, and I realised what I'd done, what a stupid thing I'd done. I was in a completely different country, nowhere to live, and I remember looking in the mirror and having that very, very acute, intense feeling of depersonalization, which I didn't identify at the time. At the time it was happening, all I remember doing was looking in the mirror and going, God, this feels weird. I need to get some sleep. And it was that simple. But funnily enough, later on, after I'd started to struggle with anxiety, and it was sort of hypochondria was my thing as well, that was when I remember it crept up on me the first time. And like you say, I latched onto it, and it was like, whoa, what's this? Like, is something wrong with my brain? I think the common ones this is the early stages of schizophrenia. That was one of mine.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Or I've got a brain tumor.
Yes. Exactly.
But it's that, for people that haven't experienced it, even though most people probably have, like you say, it feels like there's something physiologically going on.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and so I've, like I said to you before we actually started recording, I spent about £2,000 getting 2 private MRI scans to see, because I was so convinced that there was something wrong with my brain. And so, for instance, my partner, she's, when it comes to like job interviews and stuff like that, she says she gets this. So she'll go into a job interview and the nerves and stuff and everything starts to feel unreal, but she doesn't do anything with it. It's like, I'm in a job interview, I'm stressed, I've got that weird spaced out feeling. She lets it fade away, and then that's it. And is that the main difference that you think? What separates someone with transient depersonalization from chronic is what they do with that experience?
Well, what they attribute it to.
Right.
So I think you're absolutely right, and those two examples are very good. So, and as we're talking, I'm thinking, well, actually, it is much easier if you're able to attribute it to something external. It's because of the job interview, rather than, it's something internal that's gone wrong in me. You can kind of hear that they are quite different in the levels of worry that you might attach to them. And I think if there is a car accident or an earthquake or a job interview, you can see that as an external thing that is making you have that kind of detached feeling and everything kind of feeling surreal. But if it's something that's more internally generated through anxiety or through trauma reactions or through, taking some sort of a drug that's causing you to have unusual symptoms, I think then the sort of attributions and beliefs about that are a bit different. And actually, we did do a bit of research on that, because I suppose the kind of CBT model about depersonalization disorder is trying to answer that question, which was kind of set to me by the professor that I started working for at the beginning. Okay, well, why do some people get it and get over it, and other people get it and it really seems to stay and persist? And the answer seems to be how people think about those symptoms. So if it's that you're able to kind of go, oh, well, it's just because of that, then the anxiety about the symptoms themselves disappears.
Yeah.
As opposed to, oh my goodness, what on earth is this that I've got wrong with me? Is it, is that brain tumor? Is it schizophrenia? Have I, done something wrong to my brain through those drugs? I mean, all of those things. I mean, just even saying them, they're pretty scary thoughts to have, aren't they?
Yeah.
And actually adding into the other reason that I think sometimes it's not picked up is that sometimes people are so frightened about what the symptoms actually are that they don't even disclose it to their clinicians, because they're so frightened that something, especially if they blame themselves for what it is that they think has caused it. So that that anxiety about the experiences themselves seems to then be a perpetuating factor. And actually, when people get better from it, they often talk about one of the first really key steps in their recovery is about not being frightened of the symptoms themselves.
Totally. Yes. Yeah, well, I'm going to put that bit off because we're going to dig into the recovery aspect, because I know just from the forums, so many people are convinced that this is something that you can't get rid of, and I've pretty much got rid of it. I still get it occasionally, but like you say, it doesn't bother me anymore. But again, we'll get into that. But basically, I think, the sort of the take home message here, the really important. This was a sort of an aha moment for me. And this was, I got this from the book that you co-authored, which is Overcoming Depersonalization. That it's that idea of this vicious circle. So it's the anxiety kicks in. You're anxious about something, and then this protective mechanism or whatever it is, and these feelings of depersonalization kick in.
Yeah.
But then you start attributing whatever to these sensations, which causes more anxiety, which then triggers more depersonalization, and then you're just in a vicious circle. Is that an accurate?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And so that can really, as you say, that can really take it from being what could have been a transient problem to actually being something that then self-perpetuates.
Yeah. One question I have got, though, and maybe just, I don't know, from your experience with actually talking to people that struggle with this, is a possible distinction between depersonalization caused by that's drug induced, or say anxiety induced, because I've experienced both. So I've had a feeling of depersonalization from smoking weed, which ridiculous, but and both strains as well, off indica and sativa, in case anyone's wondering, and also cocaine induced as well. And I do have to say that it's way more intense, the feeling of depersonalization for me anyway, that was drug induced, and the episodes seemed to last much longer. And I was just wondering if there's any sort of qualitative or quantitative difference that you've seen between, say, drug-induced and anxiety-induced.
Well, there's not been very much research done. I mean, when one of the members of our team did some research looking at people where they had a drug triggered depersonalization, derealization, versus people who'd never really taken any drugs at all.
Yeah.
And certainly that wasn't a trigger for them. And actually, I mean, what I remember from that paper was, it was published quite a while ago, was that there really wasn't any differences between the two groups when you looked at them overall. And so I often cite that to people that are very upset that they've, smoked something or taken some drugs, and then are really beating themselves up and blaming themselves for, why did I do this? Because I then say, well, that doesn't. There's plenty of people, that take drugs and don't experience depersonalization. Plus, there's people that experience depersonalization to just the same degree. I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, that you found it more intense. But there's people that experience extremely intense depersonalization that I would say really don't appear any different from what they're experiencing, who've never taken any drugs in their life. So it's clearly something that I think the drugs can trigger it, but when I speak to people, when I really talk about what it was like when they had the experience of the depersonalization within a drug episode, there's always, so far, I've always found there's a panic attack included in that.
Yes, all 3 times, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's not necessary. The drugs some people take drugs to kind of get that feeling of being a bit spaced out, a bit detached.
Yes.
So they don't fear it at all. They actually quite like it.
Yes. You know what, Elaine? I remember speaking to somebody, having this conversation about this drug-induced depersonalization and describing the symptoms, and the girl I was speaking to, her response was, "Oh, I love that." And it's like, what?
I know. So it's so interesting. So the experience itself um, is different from the reaction to it. And one of the in terms of recovery, I know we'll come on and talk about recovery a little bit later, but we made a short documentary. It's about half-hour documentary of some of the people that have made recoveries from depersonalization. And one of the guys it's on YouTube. If you go into kind of Maudsley Hospital and depersonalization, there's a half-hour film there, and he talks about it so eloquently because he talks about his realization that there's the phenomenon of depersonalization, derealization, which he then says that's what he realized was that's kind of like 1% of the problem. The other 99% of the problem is your reaction to that experience.
Yeah.
And actually, when you separate the two out and just see it as a phenomenon, and that's what it sounds like you're doing now when you experience it. You don't really, react too much to it. And another guy that I worked with, who I remember saying, as he recovered, was kind of saying, well, I get it every so often now, but it's like having a headache. I mean, I just know it's going to get in the way a bit. I'm not going to have a great day, but it's just, it's like having a headache. You don't, catastrophize a headache. It's just, I've got a headache. I need to just try and get through the day, and then tomorrow it'll probably be better.
Yeah, I think the one with the drug induced episodes as well is that I can relate to that, beating yourself up. What did I do that for? But also there's this, you convince yourself that whatever you've smoked or whatever it is you've taken, that it's rewired your brain.
Yes.
That idea. Yes. Now, so, and I'm going to sort of segue into that now. Because another common thing that people attribute this to, I'm going off the depersonalization forums and communities and stuff that are out there, is this idea of a chemical imbalance, which sort of speaks to this idea of like the drug rewiring your brain. And I was just wondering, is there anything worth saying that you know about on the the brain neurotransmitters or brain scans, or any differences between, anyone gets a scan? Is there a difference between people with depersonalization and people that haven't? Just anything worth mentioning on that topic?
So it's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. Lots and lots of people, understandably, when we were talking about the symptoms, and especially all these strange visual symptoms that people can get, or not feeling their own body, you can see why people would think there's a neurological condition or some sort of brain disorder, because it can feel like that. It really kind of feels very... and also clinicians, I think, listening to it often kind of think, gosh, maybe there is something going on, and, maybe we should send that person off to see... often neurologists or, all sorts of, ologists of different types, even going and seeing opticians and things to see if there's something wrong with their eyes, etc. So people have often had a whole battery of tests. Now, I'm going to just state my prejudice here, because I'm a psychologist, so I am looking at this from a psychology perspective, which is much more about how we appraise the world and how we kind of see ourselves in the world, rather than from a more biological perspective. But I don't think I've met anyone who's had all the scans, etc., who's ever come back kind of finding something that actually shows that there's any kind of structural or functional changes in the brain.
Yeah.
And sometimes people aren't reassured by that, and they just think, it's not going to pick things up. Well, MRIs are extremely sensitive, and they will pick things up. And so there's been quite a lot of research that's been looking at that. The only thing that I think is kind of interesting, but I don't think it means that it's necessarily brain causing the problem, is that some of our team did a study where they were looking at people and they put them in brain scanners, and they were showing them pictures that were quite kind of disgusting. So things like cockroaches or nasty wounds and things like that. So pictures that would be a bit disgusting. and the reason for that is that disgust has a very specific part of the brain that tends to get activated with disgust. So it's very clear to see whether that's being activated or not. And what they found was that the people with depersonalization compared to people that didn't have depersonalization were showing less activation in this kind of part of the brain that indicated disgust. But in a way, that's just showing what people were saying. So they were kind of saying, well, I know it's disgusting, but I can't feel it. So I think the brain was mirroring how they were feeling, but I don't think the brain was causing it. Does that make us?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that I thought was interesting, and also some physiological sort of like skin conductance type tests where it's not your conscious mind that's controlling how you react, or in terms of sweat being released on your skin, has also shown that people with depersonalization are less physiologically reactive. But I don't think it's that's causing the depersonalization. I think that's just demonstrating that what people are saying, that they can't feel things or they can't physically or emotionally, is actually being found in testing. But I don't think it's the cause of it. I definitely see depersonalization as a very much more of a psychological issue. And I kind of get evidence for that as well when people, their symptoms kind of go up and down or changes in circumstances. So I've got one lady that I've been working with, and as she's got better, she can go on holiday and she has no depersonalization at all when she changes her environment. She has a complete 2-week break. She comes back, she gets back into, her stressful work conditions and life in London, and it comes back again.
Yes.
That doesn't work with a kind of neurological disorder. You don't kind of have, or a brain tumor. You don't have a brain tumor. You don't have a brain tumor on holiday. Then the brain tumor comes back again. It doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah.
Or even a neurological condition. You don't have kind of like Parkinson's several days, then no Parkinson's. So to me, there's the more psychological explanations. But as I say, I'm biased. I'm a psychologist, so I will be seeing it in that way. But I don't see any good evidence for there to be chemistry or sort of or neurological explanations for it.
Yeah, it makes me laugh that it's exactly the same with me. Whenever I go on holiday and I'm in a place I've never been before, and there's sort of no emotional triggers or anything around me, everything's new. My mind is completely clear. I'm fine. No anxiety, no depersonalization, nothing. And like you say, as soon as you get back home and you've got all these emotionally loaded situations and people around you, that's when it comes back. So interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move into Act 3 now and start talking about recovery. The first thing I sort of want to get out of the way is medication. So tricky to find any sort of studies and stuff to do with this, but there's one I found, and this is going back a bit now. Daphne Simeon, I think, from 2004, and on the topic of medication, it says to date treatment recommendations and guidelines for depersonalization disorder have not been established. There are a few studies assessing the use of pharmacology in this disorder. So I'm just wondering if that's still the case.
So there have been like Daphne Simeon's work, and also some of members of our team who've done drug trials. There's no specific drug for depersonalization, derealization disorder, and given what we've said about how it's very underdiagnosed, and the clinical community think, it's quite a rare thing. No drug company is going to be that interested, because they're going to think, there's no point trying to develop a medication specifically for something that there's not going to be many people buying it. But the research that has been found, well, certainly we did a a review of it quite recently in this British Medical Journal, BMJ Journal, the article that came out last year. So the best, I mean, you will get some studies where they might indicate something, but drug trials always need to be replicated because the placebo effect is very strong with medication.
Yeah.
So you kind of, give somebody something, and they'll kind of think that they're getting better from it. So they it needs to be replicated. So what certainly our clinic feel is the best evidence is for a combination of an SSRI, which is a type of antidepressant, usually in combination with another medication that's now used as a mood stabilizer, but it's got other neurochemical uses as well. So it's also used in other and sometimes medical problems as well. Called lamotrigine. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't prescribe, so I'm kind of talking about this from a informed layperson position, I suppose. And so they a combination of those two medications seems to be give the best chances for people to improve. And so that's what often will be trialed with people. But the results from that are still quite mixed. So there will be some people that it seems to make no difference at all, and other people who will notice improvement, and usually pretty quickly they'll notice improvement. And that can be really helpful in people. I've got a guy that I'm working with at the moment where the medication really has knocked his symptoms for 6. I mean, they're really almost minimal, and then in combination with techniques particularly for him, CBT techniques, his symptoms have gone to a negligible level.
Yeah.
Almost non-existent. So with some people, their medication can be really helpful, but it's not. It's a bit hit and miss. And I tend to think of it as kind of a bit 50-50 as to whether it's going to make any difference or not. But certainly for people where it's really chronic and there's not a lot of fluctuation in the symptoms, I think that's well worth trying, in combination with other things as well. So it doesn't need to be exclusive. You can try medication and do kind of talking therapies at the same time. And we probably recommend that. Some people don't want to go down the medication route and just want to have a sort of therapy approach, and that can be, again, extremely effective as well.
I've got to say, Elaine, it's interestingly there. So you mentioned this, like the combination of an antidepressant and a mood stabilizer, but not anything to do with, not anything about like anti-anxiety medication. And what I think is interesting, I just wonder if anti-anxiety medication doesn't do anything for depersonalization, does that in any way sort of undermine the anxiety theory of depersonalization? Do you know what I mean by that?
Actually, sorry, it does. So anti-anxiety medications are very helpful for depersonalization because of exactly what you're talking about. The problem with anti-anxiety medication is that, well, certainly psychologists really don't want people to become go on them, because people can then become reliant on that as a way of managing their anxiety rather than learning how to manage their anxiety. So anti-anxiety medication, so lots of people will say diazepam, brilliant for my depersonalization, but that's a very highly addictive anti-anxiety medication. So it's addictive both physiologically, because when you try and come off it, you get really bad withdrawal effects, which are very high anxiety, but it's also quite psychologically addictive as well.
Right.
That you kind of think, I'm feeling anxious, therefore I need to take a pill. So also clonazepam as well can be really helpful for people with depersonalization, and that's because those things are tackling the anxiety that's feeding and exacerbating the depersonalization, derealization. So, but we don't recommend people taking them because it's actually it potentially can become addictive for them to do that. rather than actually understanding the link. Okay, when I get really anxious, then my depersonalization, derealization also gets worse. So I need to learn how to manage my anxiety. Anxiety is a really, I always say to people, it is an emotion that we need to have. We would be extinct if we didn't have anxiety. We would have, watched the saber-toothed tiger coming towards us and kind of been relaxed about it. We would never run away.
Look at
So,
look at his big cute teeth. Yeah.
yeah, isn't he lovely? Oh, look at that bus hurtling towards me at 60 miles an hour. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
But no, we need anxiety to kind of protect ourselves. And anxiety is a completely natural emotion that we need to have. Obviously, it can get out of control and we can be anxious in situations where we don't need to be anxious anymore. So by taking something to suppress anxiety that's become sort of unnatural in that way because you're anxious about X, Y, and Z and the whole rest of the alphabet, it's better to actually learn what anxiety is and learn techniques for managing it rather than medicating anxiety.
Right. So before we sort of, I'll always say to people, whatever you're dealing with, go try and find help. Try and get with the NHS CBT therapist if you can afford it. Go private or whatever. That's fine. But with if you can't afford it and you're on the waiting list, and sort of notoriously at the moment the waiting lists are incredibly long. So it's always good if we can sort of get people going with some ideas and techniques straight away on this podcast. But before we go into that, so talking about the CBT perspective, I'm interested in the sort of the efficacy of CBT and sort of the results you see, because again, and this paper's like nearly 15 years old now, but interestingly, on the topic of CBT, the same paper says a variety of psychotherapeutic techniques have been used to treat depersonalization disorder, including trauma-focused therapy and CBT, although none of these have established efficacy to date. Now, in my own personal experience, I'd take that to task. But yeah. I just wondered from your perspective, 15 years later, and how are things looking now, results-wise?
So we did a paper that it wasn't a randomized control trial, but we had an open study where both myself and when I then went to do my clinical doctorate, the psychologist that came into the clinic after me, and we kind of collaborated, Dawn Baker, who's also a co-author on the book, and we pulled together my patients that I'd seen in therapy, her patients that she'd seen in therapy, and combined the results together. And we did find, that the group were not being compared to a control group who hadn't had therapy. So that we have to call it an open study then. But people really were benefiting from the therapy process. And I tend to see now people, I very rarely see people not benefiting in some way from the therapy process. But when I'm starting the kind of therapy with them, often people want a cure and they want a cure yesterday.
Yes.
And they never, ever want to experience these symptoms again.
Yeah.
And I completely understand that. Of course, that's what they want. But I have to kind of pull back some of those expectations. And because that can lead to feeling disappointed if you don't have other outcomes. So, I mean, I always kind of talk to people about, if we can get you to be less frightened about the symptoms, to understand what the symptoms are better, to be able to function better despite having the symptoms. Mm-hmm. And then actually what often happens, and I spent quite a bit of time listening to people's recovery stories of depersonalization, derealization, without actually having any therapy at all. How did people naturally recover? And how they naturally recover is often at some point getting to a point of not struggling with the symptoms anymore, but actually accepting them and kind of going, okay, well, there's nothing I seem to be able to do. I need to just sort of get on with my life. And in that getting on with their life, the symptoms start to go a bit more backstage.
Yes.
and then they become, less and less predominant. Often when they realise, oh gosh, I don't think I've had it for a very long time, that the symptoms may come back and they may sort of notice them again. But in doing that, people then often start to at least be able to function better with their lives despite the symptoms. But sometimes the symptoms will decline in doing that. And I think what they're doing is taking away some of the fear and the impairment that comes with the fear. But I think sometimes people misinterpret that suggestion into kind of thinking, oh, so you're just saying that I need to accept this and that, in doing that I will get better. But I am doing things. And so there's some people who are living quite active lives, but they still have the symptoms. And then I think in the therapy, it's about then seeing if there are still some underlying fears and worries that still need to be addressed. And so, yeah, I think one of the most useful things that people can do is looking, and there's quite a lot online now, but about recovery. So I say to people, don't go on the forums and read about how distressed people are.
Yep.
And all the symptoms that they're experiencing, because that will tend to make you feel a lot worse, and also feeling, oh gosh, I'm never going to get better from this. But there are a lot of recovery stories now. And as I said, the film that we made was in response to that, because often people would come into the clinic, sit down on the chair, burst into tears and say, am I ever going to get better from this? So rather than, me just try and reassure them of that, that's why we made the film, which is actually made by someone who's also made his own recovery from depersonalization. He's gone on to film school now. Was about people telling their own stories about recovery. And I think there's a lot of stories of recovery, but that recovery can be different things. It can be never having it again, or very, very, very rarely having it again. But it can also be having a different attitude towards the symptoms.
Yep.
So it becomes like living like with a, asthma or diabetes or something. You know how to manage them. You kind of have to get on with it, with this kind of slightly more chronic condition. But it doesn't get in the way of you actually living your life, doing what you want to do.
Yeah, I'd say that'd probably be my description of what I'd class as recovery. So I estimate that I still get feelings of depersonalization probably more than the general public. It tends to, if I'm ever out in a social situation, I've got maybe 2 or 3 hours, and it tends to creep in after that, and I just feel sort of, I feel it coming on, and it's it's time for me to leave or whatever. But it's sometimes I just I'll carry on in spite of it.
Yeah.
But it has become, in the beginning it was like, oh my God, what's this? It's sort of become like, oh, here we go.
Yes. And that's really helpful, isn't it? That's a really big leap in recovery.
Oh, it's huge.
Because you kind of accept it, rather than kind of struggling and railing against it, which actually just, makes it 10 times worse.
Yeah, it's that. It is. It's just. It's an acceptance of it. Not trying to breathe it away or meditate it away in the moment or anything, or push it away. Also, I think it was important for me that, when I went and got this MRI scan, and it wasn't a brain tumor. So when it wasn't a brain tumor, there was nothing under the scan, then it must be the early stages of schizophrenia. But then when you learn, well, actually, it's not that either. And
yes.
you're left with nothing else, and it's sort of, well, it's just this. It is this thing on its own, and even though I'd experience it for sometimes really extended periods, maybe a couple of weeks at a time, it's coming to that realization. At least for me, I don't know if this is for everyone. Some people claim to have it chronically for years, which may be the case. But for me, even if it was an extended period like 1 or 2 weeks, it was like, look, it always finishes at some point anyway. So, and that made it less scary for me, because I have to admit that the idea of, when it was at its most intense, and the scary thing for me was always, is this, even though it's always gone away, is this the one time that it's going to stick around and never leave?
Yes, exactly, yeah. So people, of course, that then creates a lot of anxiety.
Yes.
And what's the anxiety going to do? It's going to be fuel to
Exactly.
keeping the depersonalization.
Yes.
So that's what I'm saying about trying to tackle some of those underlying fears. Because when I walk through people, well, what happened then? It's often oh my goodness, it's come back again. Oh, this is never going to go away. How does that make you feel? Anxious and depressed and hopeless. And what's that doing to the depersonalization? Well, probably actually making it worse. So you can see the vicious cycles, how easy they are to come into play again.
Yeah, another thing, Elaine, I don't know what you think on this. This is just me sort of hypothesizing from my own experiences. I've always, since experiencing this, I've questioned the legitimacy of the idea of chronic depersonalization. Like people saying they've had it for years non-stop. And the reason I say that is when depersonalization, it became my thing. And like you were saying before, researching it, I was always researching it. And again, a quick tip here would be if listen to this podcast and then don't research it ever again. You've got enough in this podcast to keep you going, right? You don't need to research it anymore. But it became my thing. And then I think what I did was my attention, like a hypochondriac, their attention is on the body and on sensations.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
My attention became focused on the conscious experience of life itself. And so any shift in consciousness I started to think it was depersonalization. And in hindsight, it wasn't always. Sometimes I'm just tired. Sometimes I'm fatigued, or I've just got that dizziness that comes on every now and again. Sometimes maybe my blood sugar was low. But for me, it became every second of the day was me monitoring where I was on the depersonalization spectrum. And again, looking back at it now, I don't know if I necessarily believe in it in that sense, and whether it is depersonalization is there, it's at a high level all the time, chronic, or whether it's really just people focusing on their conscious experience and always rating it. And I just wonder what you think about that.
Well, like you say, that is that self-focused attention that I might call it. That continually taking your depersonalization thermometer, checking out how bad is it now and what's it like now, and that is a really key feature of it, particularly in the very acute phase, where there is that kind of obsession that happens with the depersonalization and the constant checking of it. I don't know. I mean, I do have people that I meet in the clinic who do talk about having it fairly constantly for years. I don't think that necessarily means that everyone has to experience that, because often they haven't. In my perception, I think that they haven't had very good treatment,
right?
And that's why they've also had it for years.
Yeah.
But I think even with people that might have had it constantly for a long period of time, what I would be looking at with them is to see whether there's any shift in the severity of it. So I often start with people, and if you're talking about what people can kind of do for themselves, just kind of doing a bit of that monitoring at the beginning, but monitoring and noticing actually things do get better and things maybe do get worse, and what's linked to that, and doing a bit of analysis on that. And then you can sort of put it to bed a bit and kind of go, okay, well, these are the things that make it worse. These are the things that make it better.
Yeah.
But you can kind of dig down the things that are making it worse. Why are those things making it worse? What could be the underlying features or mechanisms that might be making it worse? And the things that are making it better, why is that? And you often see things like, being in more anxiety-producing situations. That might be social for some people, like you were saying, or more stress. And often people, and also more focus on yourself. And people often say whether it's the symptom, you can get into a bit of a philosophical discussion. Is it that the symptoms are actually better, or is it that you're not aware of the symptoms?
Yeah.
Either is good. So I just think, well, it doesn't really matter. If you're not noticing the symptoms, then, that's good, as well as the symptoms actually are better. That they actually have decreased, whatever it is. And often people are then saying, well, when I get really engaged in something, or when I'm distracted by something, that I notice it less and they seem better. So those are good things to build on, but in the long term, distraction is not necessarily helpful. You can't distract yourself 24/7. And at any point where you come back to, there isn't a engaging distraction, you will then come back and notice the symptoms again and kind of go, oh my goodness, they're still here and I'm still not going to get any better. So distraction is not helpful in the long term. You actually need to approach this and understand the symptoms and your own pattern of those. And in that understanding, you gain your kind of power and control back. You kind of understand what it is for what it is.
Yeah.
It's this, very strange, potentially very frightening phenomenon. But if you understand what it is, it's a lot less frightening. You can then start to manage symptoms a bit better, cope with them a bit better, and then maybe look at. I also spend quite a lot of time in the therapy looking at, and I'm rewriting the book at the moment, and I'm trying to put this into the book so people can do it for themselves. I also spend quite a bit of time in the therapy helping people see what are the factors that contributed to my depersonalization starting, and also what are the things that may have contributed to it in the longer term. So those may have been longer term difficulties. They may have been, childhood anxieties that kind of built up over time. And then suddenly I had, the proverbial kind of final straw that kind of tipped the depersonalization into starting.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite useful to look at your own personal history and because that will also indicate what are the things that may cause it to, even if you do recover, that may cause it to come back and bite you a bit later on. Because I always say to people, this will be something that at particular times of stress or anxiety or where bad things happen to you, this will kind of be your default that you might go back to. So don't be too shocked or surprised or dismayed if later on you find that actually, oh my goodness, it's come back again. Understand what is causing it. See what's kind of going on for you, and then you'll be able to go, oh, it's probably because of this, that, and the other. So there's a woman that I've been working with recently, and we do that quite a lot. She'll kind of say, oh, it's come back again. I'm really not sure about it. And in talking through together what's going on in her life, sometimes we can, laugh about it actually and kind of go, okay, well, maybe it's because I'm trying to move house. I've got a brand new job that's extremely stressful. My child is ill at the moment. Okay, maybe I have got some stresses in my life. And you kind of, maybe that's why the depersonalization has come back to me. And I think for some people it can also become a bit of a habit.
Yes.
That having experienced this kind of altered state of being, that it's quite easy to kind of click into that again. So I think that there's potential that when people have experienced it for a period of time, that even though they might recover, they can click back into that with probably less input, or less. What's the word I'm trying to say? Less stress and overload. They'll click into it quicker. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so again, that doesn't mean to say that and I think that's one of the things that again may perpetuate it. But again, understanding that can allow you to kind of, oh, that's why it's happened again. So lots of people, when human beings under pressure and stress, we all have our little idiosyncratic pattern of things that we might go to. So whether it's, I don't know, compulsive gambling or, zoning out on the internet or, binge watching TV series or whatever it is, some of them more helpful than others. We might have our own little ways of kind of dealing with, stress and difficulties in our lives. And for some people, this depersonalization, derealization can be a way of kind of clicking, that can click in as a way of just detaching from the often difficult realities that people have to face in their lives.
Well, sort of speaking to that idea of, people wanting rid of it yesterday, I hate asking this question sometimes. Sometimes people have an answer, sometimes they don't. But Is there any sort of CBT exercises that somebody could go away and do now, like something very immediate that they could start working on?
Yeah, so good. So I think one of the first things that I do with people is just give a bit of an explanation. So what depersonalization is. So that's, this podcast would have been helpful. We've kind of talked about that, really. What are the key things that tend to trigger it? What might be kind of keeping it going? So some of the anxiety and the worry about what the phenomenon are is going to be. So understanding and normalizing that. So a lot of people kind of say, well, I had no idea that it was so common. So I remember when I was in the clinic earlier on, I used to do all these kind of fancy techniques later on, and getting feedback at the end of the therapy. Often people said, well, that first session where you told me how common it is, that was really the most helpful bit of it all.
Yeah.
And stuff. So I kind of think, okay, so that's really important to know that it's a common phenomenon. This seems to be what, when people can't escape and they feel overwhelmed, this can be triggered off as a way of kind of detaching and sort of numbing some of that distress and understanding, therefore, why it might keep going when you're so frightened of it, that it's a kind of proverbial sort of balloon underwater. The more you try and push something away, the more it's going to pop up and be with you. And that self-focused attention that you're talking about. So understanding all of that is really helpful. And then I often get people to start by keeping this a sort of hourly diary, doing this, what's the level of my depersonalization, doing the next thing, what's it like then, and looking to see when is it at its best, when is it at its worst, and then starting to understand what the things are that are making it more difficult for you, and then working out what you need to do to make those a bit easier. So that might be about dealing with low mood, and it might be dealing with anxiety, because I would say that with most people, they've got the depersonalization, derealization, but there's often anxiety and low mood attached to it. So maybe working on some of those things. I will often say to people, if they're waiting to come into a specialist clinic, I will often say, well, it'd be quite helpful for you to learn how to deal with some of your anxiety, deal with some of your low mood in the meantime, because that will help the depersonalization, derealization. For people where it's a bit more on and off, it's worth maybe trying some of what's called grounding strategies that can just make you feel a little bit more, the word grounded, feeling a bit more kind of in the moment, less detached. And there's a section in the book about that. And that can be things like objects, so having particularly pieces of jewelry or key rings, or mobile phones are great now for people. So you can put messages on your mobile phone. You can record messages for yourself. Even, photographs on your phone can help just bring you back to a sense of being kind of present and now and calm.
Yep.
Smells are very good for grounding. So, finding a particular smell that really works for you that can bring you back. So I've got somebody at the moment who, has taken to using, the sort of Vicks smell, just that's what they like. Or I've had other people that, have used a particular smells just to, when they feel that the depersonalization is getting a bit worse. So a mixture of some of these, finding out what works for you. I've also had people that have literally just used like a little rough pebble or something in their pocket, and just that sensation of touching that, and will just bring them back if they're starting to feel that they're starting to feel more detached and depersonalized. I suppose one of the key things that's sometimes a bit harder to do on your own is looking at what the thoughts are that when the symptoms are there, and often there's quite catastrophic thoughts that are going to create more anxiety, or thoughts that are going to create more low mood, and actually capturing those thoughts and looking at them, and rather than kind of trying to avoid them or dismiss them, actually looking at them, pinning them down, and actually looking at how evidence-based they are. So you were talking, Danny, earlier about, I might have a brain tumor.
Yep.
And actually, that thought maybe would have been terrifying for you.
Yep.
But actually by kind of just, oh, that's so frightening, I don't even want to think about it, actually just maintains the problem. But actually sitting down and thinking, okay, well, what's the evidence that I've got a brain tumor? Don't know. Is there any evidence? It feels like I've got a brain tumor, but is there actually any factual evidence?
Yeah.
What's the evidence that I don't? Well, I've had, rather expensive MRI scans. Nothing came up from it.
Yeah.
People have told me that it's not to do with brain tumors. And you start to you can then use your intellect to kind of argue over some of these very frightening thoughts that are often not based in evidence.
Yeah, don't believe everything you think. That's my slogan. Yeah, don't take your own thoughts as evidence.
Yes, exactly. Thoughts are not facts.
No,
it's quite a good summary. So just because I think something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And I suppose the other bit that comes from the B bit of CBT is looking at how you behave in response to some of these things. So often people will withdraw from situations. It's difficult when I go into busy places. It's difficult when I go into social situations. Those situations make my depersonalization, derealization worse. So I'll avoid them. I've got this kind of little, not very funny catchphrase about avoid avoidance, because avoidance is really really doesn't get you anywhere in the long term. Short term, you might kind of withdraw from it and you kind of go, oh gosh, I feel a bit better. But actually what you're doing is learning that you can't cope in that situation. And in the end, it's quite demoralizing. So it's much better to try and learn some ways of managing in the situation, understand what's happening, try and go back into the situation and see if you can manage it a little bit, stay in the situation, manage it, and come out when you feel a tiny bit better, and then you come away going, oh, okay, well, I seem to have, I'm pleased that I did that, and I did really well doing that, and actually maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And that's a really important phrase. I sometimes say to people, I wish I had a little stamp that I didn't need to keep writing that down. I could just go, oh, there we go. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Because often there's anticipatory anxiety attached to things. People avoid, it's worse in their mind than it is in reality. So they often avoid doing things. And it can, depersonalization can lead to people kind of really shutting down all sorts of areas of their lives. So that bit of trying to carry on despite the symptoms is really important. And actually being really compassionate to yourself and really, being an inner coach, as I call it, rather than the inner critic. So rather than getting out the big stick and beating yourself up, just being really, pleased with yourself for getting through the day with all these difficult symptoms that you're having to deal with. So a kind of mixture of those things, I would say, that are quite helpful for people to try and get some sense of being able to manage and cope with the symptoms as best they can.
Yeah, and well, I'll quickly throw out a couple of my own, Elaine, and just see what you think of them. So one, I think is super important, and you do mention this in the book, is get your sleep in order, sort your sleep out.
Yes, good point. Yeah.
Yeah, massive. So I did an episode on this. Episode 15, Professor Jason Ellis. Yeah, he said, as soon as sleep falls apart, something wicked this way comes. And it's always stuck with me, that. And apparently the research at his lab has shown that sleep is a better predictor of the onset of any sort of mental health condition than any other factor, any other lifestyle factor. So yeah, getting your sleep in order and getting into a routine. I recommend that, not just theoretically, but, again, from personal experience.
Definitely, yeah.
In the moment when you, so depersonalization is a very, when we were describing it, it's a very visual experience. And so one thing I figured out is, like you're talking about the flat colours or things look like a hologram or two-dimensional. Wherever you are, if you're experiencing depersonalization, sit there and close your eyes for a minute. And for me, at least, I realised that maybe 90% of the sensation was a visual experience. Now, obviously, we can't walk around with our eyes closed to numb it. But I found wearing sunglasses or shades helped. And this is a bit of bro science. I don't know if there's anything in it, but I kind of took away from it that because depersonalization for me was a very visual experience. By wearing sunglasses, it muted the visual input from the world, and it was sort of like less sensory overload was sort of taking place. And also the world looked weird because I'd made it look weird, because I'd put these shades on which changed the colour and everything, and I was in control of it. And not a magic bullet, but it definitely it turned the volume down for me. And another thing was I found that...
Can I just interject with something there?
Yeah.
Now, the only thing that I would say is that you might want to do that only at times where it's really at its worst. Because the difficulty that can happen with things where you kind of think, okay, well, here's something that I do to kind of help it, but actually they can become quite... what would be called in CBT terms sort of safety-seeking behaviour.
Yes.
So I have to have my sunglasses on at all times, because I have met people where, we're sitting inside with, really dark sunglasses on.
Yeah, looking like a rock star.
Those things, and those things can, then they, they feel like they can't manage without them.
Right.
So with kind of all those things that might help you, I always kind of take away what someone said to me once. Try and use them quite lightly.
Yes.
Try not to become overly dependent on those things, because then they're very difficult to give up on. A bit like some of the anti-anxiety drugs. They're very hard to come off from them. So I agree, but maybe try and use them at times where you just have them as an emergency thing to use. Yeah,
well, I'd say the same thing is sort of just to take the edge off. So look, don't leave the house with the sunglasses, but have them with you ready for when it's getting a bit too intense, and you just want to turn the volume down before you head off home or do whatever.
Yeah. And again, I still would say that I would prefer someone to learn something that's actually internally, that they don't need to have an external prop.
Okay.
Because, you go out, you leave your sunglasses behind somewhere or something like that, then you're kind of like, oh my goodness, I don't have my prop with me that makes it better. So if there's something that you can do, like you were just saying, even just closing your eyes for a minute or two and just doing something, and maybe imagery can be quite useful then, just kind of, using some sort of image that helps you to feel a bit more connected or calm, and then coming back into the world again. But I prefer people to use something that's kind of a strategy rather than an external prop, because those strategies you don't lose, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, well, I've got three more as well, quickly. One is, we've already sort of talked about it, is learning to accept different phases of consciousness. So you're not gonna wake up in the morning bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and feel 100% all day. That's just life. We all shift through different phases of consciousness, whether we're feeling tired or foggy, brain fog, we've got an headache, we're just not in the mood, we're in a bad mood, a good mood. Learning to accept that, and again, not attribute every shift in consciousness to this is depersonalization on some level. Maybe you're just hungry, maybe you're just tired, and if you're just tired, just leave it as tired. Another on acceptance is when you haven't got the depersonalization, just accept the good times. Don't question it, because what I tended to do was, if I was having a day where I felt good, it was like, oh my God, I feel amazing. Shit, when's the depersonalization going to come back?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and tainting it. And the final one is, for people that have got this, that would describe their depersonalization as an out-of-body experience where they don't feel like they're inside themselves anymore, which is very much mine. And this sounds like one of them sort of wishy-washy recommendations, but try yoga. And I don't mean the relaxing sort of meditative yoga. I mean the hardcore working out yoga. Let me tell you something. There's something called a revolved half moon, right? I think it's called that. And you have to be in and conscious of every part of your body, the way your fingers are extending, your elbow positioning, the way you're sucking your stomach in, you've got one leg straight, your toes are pointing out on one foot, they're pointing up on the other. And when you're running through this with somebody and they're telling you, let me tell you, so you just try and have your attention elsewhere when you're actually doing yoga properly. I challenge it, and it's just not possible. And it's like we were saying about a grounding. I don't know if it's quite the same thing, but yoga, more than any other, and I've done lifting weights and running, yoga slams you straight back into your body and keeps you there for the duration of the workout. And it's almost magic bullet territory, I've got to say. So I recommend that as well. So,
well, I totally agree. I would include other kind of forms of movement which are not necessarily repetitive. So I think some of the other ones that you're describing, even running, and also I know people that find running helpful, something that gets you feeling your body and feeling in your body. But the ones that are more repetitive, you can kind of zone out from a bit more. As you said, something like yoga, where it's, lifting this up a centimeter and moving that and doing that. You can't really, there's so many instructions, and you can't sort of zone out from it. You're very intensely concentrating on what you're doing physically. So a lot of people will say that exercise of some type or some sort of physical thing is usually very helpful for them.
Right, okay, Elaine. So, what I usually like to do with these interviews, I usually sort of close them out with a few quick-fire questions, but I know we're running really short on time. So what I'm just going to do sneakily now, I'm just going to cram one in before I let you go. And It's probably the most important one. And that is, apart from your own, which I will include in the show notes, do you have any book recommendations, either on this topic or just anything else you feel would be of value to the listeners?
Okay, well, there's quite a lot of books on depersonalization that are useful, but I suppose if you wanted the kind of CBT Bible is a book called Mind Over Mood. And I would really recommend that for people with depersonalization or with any other problem. It's a self-help book that, as I say, is a kind of textbook that is freely available. You can get it in the library, and I would highly recommend that. It's got all the basic CBT techniques that are really well explained.
Yes, well, I can. I'll back you up on that one, because I have got that book. It was Mind Over Mood and Feeling Good by David Burns, were the first two CBT books I got started with.
Okay,
and
good.
I've got to say, Mind Over Mood is full of exercises for people to do. It's a very sort of proactive book. And again, I think quickly with people with depersonalization, well, as anyone else with depression or anxiety or whatever, when we recommend these books to you, please do the exercises. Read the book cover to cover and actually do the exercises. Don't
a good point.
Don't do what I was guilty of this, so I'm not just pointing fingers, but I read both those books in the early days, and I tried a couple of the exercises very casually for a couple of weeks, and it didn't change my life instantly, and it was like, oh well, they're bollocks, they obviously don't work. No, The recommendation is, read the book all the way through, do the exercises for 6, 8, 12 weeks, stick with it, and, you will see a difference. Anyway, Elaine Hunter, thank you very much for joining me. Is there have you got any links or websites, anything you'd like to direct people towards?
Well, there's a few links that I can send to you. So there's, the depersonalization recovery film. There's the Victoria Derbyshire show. We've got a couple of podcasts. The BMJ, we did a podcast. There's a Jeremy Vine show, kind of podcast and phone in. So some of the recent media work that we've been doing, I think, will be really helpful for people to kind of hear people talking about depersonalization, what it is, people with lived experience of it, and also talking about, how they've got better from it, because that is the really key message. No matter how bad you are at the moment, no matter how long you've had these problems for, you can get better.
Yeah, definitely. That was it, Elaine. I've got to say, I think the depersonalization for me, when it was at its worst, was the thing that sort of almost pushed me over the edge. And I've talked about this in a previous episode about, I went through a very brief period of suicidal ideation, and that was very much fueled by how intense the experience was getting for me. But I've come back from it. I'm perfectly fine. And if an idiot like me can do it, anybody can do it. No one's cut from, no one's cut from a different cloth. That's the way I look at it. So So, yeah, good.
Well, it's been great being interviewed by you, Danny, because actually, because of your own experiences, it's a much more informed interview.
Yeah.
And it's really great to hear about your own kind of recovery from it.
Yeah.
As you say, it's a very positive message to give to people.
Yeah, well, that's nice of you to say, Elaine. So, thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Danny.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode, for those of you who didn't enjoy this episode, you guys can bugger off and skip this bit because it doesn't apply to you. But if you did enjoy this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, there are a number of ways you can do so. You could blast out a little mention on social media saying, yeah, check this knobhead out, he's actually pretty good. You could like our Facebook page or leave us a review there, even better. Just search for My Own Worst Enemy on Facebook. I'm sure we'll pop up. You could leave us a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or whichever podcast service you happen to use. It's always a nice way of encouraging new listeners to give us a whirl. Or, if you're feeling particularly generous and you feel that this podcast is genuinely adding some value and you'd like to support it in a more long-term sense, then you can become a subscriber for as little as £1 a month, or you could just make a one-off donation, again, for as little as £1. So, yeah, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, just go to myownworstenemy.org/support, but only if you can afford it, and, no donations from stolen credit cards either, please. Can't be arsed with that hassle. So, yeah, plenty of things to keep you busy there while I go busy myself putting the next episode together. So, in the meantime, as I always say, behave yourselves, but not too much, and I'll see you again next time.